Today's journaling inspiration comes from the life of a Nazi war hero, Corporal Johann Punzel. The time was 1940, and the place was Differdange, a town in Luxembourg. Now, World War I had begun, and the French and the Germans were fighting very close to Differdange. Luxembourg was a neutral country. However, neutrality is not terribly useful when people are fighting a war in your backyard. So the Differdangers knew that they would have to evacuate, but they were concerned about something. You see, most of the men in Differdange worked for the local steel mill. The mill was a wooden structure with wooden outbuildings. The steel mill caught on fire. 4,000 men would be out of work. The town would effectively be bankrupt. There wouldn't be a point to going back. So the foreman of the steel mill came up with an idea. He called his bravest steel workers, those who doubled as a fire brigade, and asked for volunteers to stay behind. 17 men volunteered, and one brave woman volunteered as well, Mrs. Waller, who was the wife of one of the firemen. With that, the rest of the Differdangers left. The firemen weren't too worried about their safety during the battle, because underneath the front office of the steel mill, there was a very sturdy air raid shelter, and they knew that they could hide down there and be safe, which is exactly what they did. The French and Germans fought over the town of Differdange for 2 days before the Germans finally pushed the French away. Now, at first, everything was fine between the Differdangers and the Germans. The Differdange firemen were hard workers, and there was a lot of work that needed to be done. Debris had to be cleared from the streets and the buildings, and dead animals needed to be buried, and there were also some fires that needed to be put out because some of the German soldiers were a little careless. And then everything changed. The French began lobbing bombs into the camp of the Germans, and these bombs were uncannily accurate. They successfully picked out camouflage tanks, hidden weapons caches, ammunition dumps. After a few days, it was obvious the Germans had a spy somewhere in the ranks. Now, one of the lieutenants got it in his head that the guilty party had to be one of the firemen of Differdange. So he had them kicked awake one night, strip searched, including Mrs. Waller, and he had the air raid shelter gone over with a fine-tooth comb. In fact, with hammers. They searched for hollow spots in the wall. They tried to find any kind of wire, any signaling equipment, telegraph line, anything at all that the Differdangers could have used to communicate with the French. Yeah, they found nothing, not a thing. And it didn't change the lieutenant's mind one bit. He had men surround the steel mill, and especially the air raid shelter, and guard the firemen. They were effectively prisoners for 3 days. And on the 3rd day, the French bombardment began again. And again, it was horribly accurate. Now the lieutenant was furious. He knew it was their fault. And in the morning, he had the military police go and get them and march them through town toward him. And as the firemen marched, they noticed along the side of the road a ditch had been dug. And the same thought went through many of their minds. That's deep enough for 18 people. They reached the lieutenant, who was in a dirty, wet, cold, dark garage that had just one tiny barred window. It was the perfect place for a jail. The lieutenant had them lined up and marched up and down the line saying, "We know one or more of you have been signaling the French, and if the guilty party does not come forward, at the end of the hour, you will all be shot. Well, the Differdangers hadn't even known why they were being searched or guarded or herded into the garage. They had no way of contacting the French, no reason to contact the French, absolutely no opportunity, especially in the last 3 days. But the lieutenant was not in a listening mood. He went to Corporal Johann Punzel, who was standing beside the men of Differdange, and said, "These men are now under your control. If they do not confess, at the end of the hour, I want you to take them out of here 2 by 2 and have them shot by the firing squad. Their graves have already been dug." With that, the lieutenant left. Poor Punzel, he didn't know what to do. He couldn't imagine how the firefighters could have possibly signaled anyone. The firemen pleaded with Punzel to believe them, that they were innocent, that they had done nothing. And the foreman said, why couldn't another search be done? It could search the entire steel mill. It could go over the air raid shelter again. It could prove that we're innocent. There's no evidence at all. And Punzel thought that was a really good idea. So he went to his commanding officer, but his commanding officer was too busy to listen and just waved him away and said, "Go take that to the judge advocate's office." So Punzel did. He went to the judge advocate's office. He spoke to an aide there, and he told him his concerns. And the aide went out of the tent and was gone for 45 minutes before he returned. The firemen were almost out of time. The aide had a little bit of good news, mostly bad news, not so good. The firemen did have a stay of execution granted for 24 hours, but if none of them confessed after that time, they would be shot. And if the French bombardment began again, they would immediately be shot. And there was no appeal, and no further investigation would be done. Punzel hadn't expected that. He was a by-the-book kind of guy. Going through channels had always worked for him before. Not this time. As he walked back to the firemen, he thought over the exact wording of the order the lieutenant had given him. The lieutenant had said, "these men." He hadn't said a word about poor Mrs. Waller. So when Punzel got to the garage, he went and took Mrs. Waller by the hand, led her out of the building, found a truck bound for Luxembourg City, put her on it, and sent her on her way. Now he only had 17 innocent lives to worry about. And he had no idea how he could possibly save them. But he could make them more comfortable. He took them out of the garage and he led them across the street to a storeroom that was at least dry and warm, and he had hot coffee and food brought to them. Thank you so much for your time. If you liked this video, please hit like and let me know. Nothing else he could do. That night, Corporal Johann Punzel could not sleep. He kept listening for the French bombardment, which would mean the firemen were to be killed at once. He had a terrible decision to make. On the one hand, he had the lives of 17 innocent men. On the other hand, he had his own life and the welfare of his little family, of his wife and his 2 little daughters. What would happen to them? What would happen to the family of the man the Nazis called traitor? It was the hardest decision he'd ever made, but by dawn, he'd made it. He ordered his men to stay with the prisoners in the storeroom and not to leave, not for any reason, not for breaks, not for lunch, until he personally released them. And at lunchtime, he went to the judge advocate's office, not to talk to anyone there, but to make sure all the lieutenants were at lunch. He hurried back to the garage. Sure enough, the other guards had left. The only people left were his own men who were loyal to him and had stayed. He asked one of the steelworkers, "Can you get your hands on a truck at the steelworks?" And the man said, of course he could get his hands on a truck. So Punzel sent him to the steel mill with two of his own loyal men. They came back with the truck, and Punzel said to the firemen, "You're free. Go, get on the truck. Quick, get out of here." Believe it. They wanted to shake his hand. They wanted to give him money. They wanted to give him their watches, like one of the few things of value they still possessed. Punzel wasn't having it. He hurried them out. He gave them his full name on the way out because they begged, but that's all. And he sent them on their way. Once the truck was out of sight, poor Punzel began to shake like an aspen leaf in a hurricane. It's one thing to make the decision. It's another thing to know that in less than 2 hours you're going to face the consequences. The firing squad would arrive and they would be shooting somebody all right. Now Punzel's men were so proud of him. Whatever happened, they wanted him to know that they were proud of his courage, proud of his humanity, proud of him for doing what he felt was right. But you know what? It didn't make Punzel feel the least bit better. And then a miracle happened. Orders came from headquarters that Punzel's unit was to decamp immediately and proceed to the Maginot Line. In the hustle and bustle of changing camps and getting everything loaded, none of the lieutenants thought to ask about the fate of the firemen of Differdange. And you know, nobody ever did. For today's journaling assignment, think back on a time in your life when your conscience, what you believed to be right, conflicted with what society was telling you is right, or what you were told at work was the right thing to do, or what your family wanted you to do. Write about the decision you made, the struggle that you had making it, and how you felt afterwards. Write about what you feel you would do now, knowing what you know. Thank you so much for your time. If you liked this video, please hit like and let me know. You'll be all ready to tune in next week when we have a story about a man who discovered there's no such thing as a coincidence and karma is real.